Immanuel Kant lived from 1724 to 1804. He was German. He lived in a city that at that time was called Königsberg. It's now part of Russia, but at that time it was part of the German state of Prussia. Kant was a university professor of philosophy, but he was also a scientist, specifically an astrophysicist. Kant was the first scientist to publish the nebular hypothesis. This is the theory that the stars and planets developed out of a cloud of particles that rotated and condensed into masses because of gravity. This is still the leading theory of how stars and planets were formed. One consequence of Kant being a scientist is that when we're reading Kant, we need to remember that he thinks like an astrophysicist. Knowing that will help us grasp how he writes. There are two important aspects to this. First, he's looking for a universal ethical system. His model is Isaac Newton's theory of gravity, which at that time was fairly new. Newton died just a couple of years after Kant was born. Newton called his theory of gravity the theory of universal gravitational attraction. Now, we often unreflectively think of gravity as describing the way heavy objects fall to the earth, but that's a very limited part of gravity. The principle of universal gravitation is that every body possessing mass in the entire universe exerts a force of attraction over every other object in the universe that has mass, in direct proportion to the mass of the objects. So if we think about a dancer leaping off the stage into the air, if we talk about the effect of gravity as what pulls the dancer's body back down toward the earth, we've missed a couple of really important points. The first is that gravity is not specific to the earth. It holds for all objects with mass in the entire physical universe. The second is that along with Earth's pull toward the dancer's body, when she jumps, also pulls the earth toward her, just in a much smaller amount. But the effect of gravitational attraction is always reciprocal. So there are three ideas here that are going to carry over from physics into ethics for Kant. Those three ideas are universality, lawfulness, and reciprocity. So we're going to have to talk a lot about universality. The main point to understand in the beginning is that Kant is looking not just for the highest ethical principle, but actually for a universal moral principle. I talked very early in this course about the fact that philosophers are always searching for and hoping for ethical principles that hold for every human being, regardless of when in history that person lives, what their culture is, where they live, and what religion they do or don't believe in. Kant takes it a step further. He wants to try to discover an ethical principle that would hold for all intelligent life forms, whether they're human or not. Then we would be guaranteed that the principle would apply to all human beings as a subset of intelligent beings. Now, of course, we don't know for sure that there are other intelligent beings in the universe, so we'll have to leave that hypothetical for now. But I'll mention this point in passing and come back to it later. Kant does believe that extraterrestrial intelligent life forms exist, and we probably should too. Kant does not think that intelligent non-human animals exist on Earth, terrestrial non-human intelligences, in other words, but we probably should, thinking of dolphins, apes, and so forth. Whatever we say about aliens and dolphins, we can grasp that Kant wants to discover an ethical principle that would apply to all intelligent life, not just human life. That would be something that would really be an universal ethical principle, something like gravity for ethics. And that's connected to the idea of lawfulness. When Kant writes about a moral law, he's not thinking primarily about what's known as juridical law. That's the kind of law that's made in Congress or Parliament or the Knesset, judged by the courts and enforced by the police and prisons. Instead, Kant is thinking of the moral law on analogy with scientific laws. Now, Kant doesn't mean that it's impossible to violate the moral law in the way that it's impossible to violate gravity. What he does mean is that there are no legitimate exceptions to the moral law. For example, Kant thinks that he can demonstrate to us that lying is wrong, and that there is no circumstance whatsoever under which it would be ethically justifiable to law. In other words, for Kant, the ethical law is absolute. Once we've found the highest ethical principle, there are no exceptions to it whatsoever. There can be differences of judgment and interpretation, but there can be no actual exceptions. Finally, the third principle Kant borrows from physics is reciprocity. In physics, I mentioned that reciprocity has to do with the dancer who leaps off the stage, attracting the earth just as the earth attracts her, just to a lesser degree. In the case of ethics, reciprocity comes when we talk about rights and duties. Every time I claim a right for myself, I at the same time put an obligation on myself of extending that right toward everyone else. There's an echo here of the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have others do unto you. Many of us get taught the golden rule as a religious principle, but Kant thinks we don't need religious belief to teach it to us. Kant thinks that something like the golden rule should arise spontaneously in every human being's mind as soon as we begin to think about decision making. We'll see later in detail how Kant transfers the three concepts of universality, lawfulness, and reciprocity from physics into ethics. It's enough for now to know that when we're reading Kant, we're reading the work of a physicist philosopher, not a plain old philosopher. Again, Kant thinks and writes like a scientist in a way that is highly analogous to the way that John Stuart Mill thinks and writes as a politician, as a member of the British Parliament. There's one more way that Kant thinks like a scientist that I haven't mentioned yet, and that has to do with what philosophers call determinism. The physical universe is governed by laws of physics, biology, and even psychology. Our brains work in particular ways, including through our instincts. So there is always the question, if everything in the world is determined by laws, does the idea of free will, the idea that human beings make choices, does that idea even make any sense? Or should we say that we, however we appear to ourselves, are just stimulus response machines? We just get certain inputs from our experience, and that leads through laws of nature to certain outputs in terms of our decisions and behavior. So is there any real choice? If not, then it doesn't make any sense to talk about ethics, since it is not actually within our power to make any choices in the first place. As a scientist, Kant is well aware of this problem, knowing as he does the laws of nature from the inside, and yet he still believes in ethics, which must mean that he still believes in free will. Again, I won't try to solve this problem for you in any detail in an introductory lecture, but we do want to be aware that this is an acute problem for Kant and to see how on earth he's going to address it.